What's up, everybody? Welcome back to the Tomatuito Boxing Show. Let's dive into the lightweight division that has had a lot of movement as of recent, and definitely in the first quarter of the year. Well, actually, the last few months. Let's just say the last few months, May and June, because the movement happened mid-May, where Lomachenko beats Kambosos, stops Kambosos, gets his hands around the IBF title in the lightweight division, the title that long eluded him. And then we had Navarrete moving up, taking a shot at the vacant WBO title at 135 at the lightweight division against a fellow countryman of Lomachenko's in Denis BERINCHYK, and a fellow teammate of his out when they both campaigned in the Olympics for Ukraine. Denis BERINCHYK ended up getting the decision win over Navarrete and crowning himself as the newest addition to the champions in the lightweight division, crowning himself as a WBO champ. Two Ukrainians as champions in the lightweight division, the Matrix, Vasily Lomachenko, and Denis BERINCHYK. The WBA has Tank Davis as a champion, and the WBC has Shakur. Shakur has made a lot of noise as of recent because of his performance. He had a really good performance. He had a solid performance. A boxistically near flawless performance against Haratunian out in his home territory of Newark, New Jersey. Had about 8,000 plus in attendance. Apparently, the highest viewership for ESPN as far as boxing is related this year. But it was the final fight of his contract, and a lot was made of that fight and from that fight. Both critiques that it was a boring fight, critiques that he continues to be a boring fighter, even though he's guaranteeing knockouts, guaranteeing to stop his opponent, such as what he told Haratunian after the weigh-in. He said he was going to knock him out to watch out for the body. He made claims that he was going to bounce back in impressive fashion, and that's why everybody tuned in to see if Shakur was actually going to deliver on his promises from the lackluster performance he had against Edwin de los Santos, which was a win nonetheless. That's when he fought for the vacant title, the WBC title, and became champ. And the fight ended up being, boxistically, a near flawless performance for Shakur Stevenson. But people were not happy with it. People were not happy with his performance. There was no action that he pressed. He had this opponent hurt numerous times during the fight, and he failed to get him out of there. Instead, he cruised to a decision, and that's where the negativity began to flow. So this very same lightweight division, on the same night that Shakur was fighting, Camarón William Cepeda was out in action against Giovanni Cabrera on the opposite coast, out in Ontario, California, and he was successful and stopped Giovanni Cabrera in 3 rounds. Haratunian coming off a tightly contested matchup against Frank Martin, and that's what led him into this fight with Shakur. Giovanni Cabrera was coming off of a 12-round decision loss to Pitbull Cruz, and that landed him this fight with Camarón Cepeda. Both opponents in equal stages of their career, and both stars, headliners, had all the spotlight on them, and the one that performed in a more fan-friendly fashion was Camarón Cepeda by coming away with the stoppage. And the one that walked away with the critiques, even though he's a solid boxer, a near elite level boxer in Shakur Stevenson, put on a great performance, a lot better, 10 times better than the Shakur that we saw against Edwin de los Santos. So this past weekend, Top Rank ended up having the big middleweight showdown scheduled between Mikhailovich, who was challenging the unified middleweight champ in Janibek, Elim Kanuli. Janibek ends up failing to make the fight due to dehydration, severe dehydration, gets pulled, and two lightweights are elevated who were supposed to be in the co-main event, ended up becoming the main event, and that being Raymond Muratalla against Tevin Farmer. A solid fight. What we saw was a really tightly contested, fun fight to watch between Tevin Farmer and Muratalla. A little bit frustrating at times, because when we see Muratalla was built as a Tommy Hearns type figure, where he was just knocking everybody that stepped in the ring against him, just knocking them out, hurting them, picking them apart, getting rid of them. Until the opposition started getting a little bit higher level for him. 21 wins, perfect record now for Muratalla, who got the decision win over Tevin Farmer. A controversial one at last to some people, because it was such a tight fight that many people felt that it would have been a draw, or maybe even Tevin Farmer, who outpunched him according to CompuBox stats, outpunched Raymond Muratalla. But the output that Muratalla put in the final rounds of the fight is what apparently got him the win, and what impressed the judges, who ended up giving him the decision win. Tevin Farmer boxed, was on his bicycle, moved, clinched when needed, punched, stick and move, landed some power punches, clean, landed some hooks, clean punches on Muratalla. And Muratalla failed to eliminate Tevin Farmer, even though he had him hurt several times, especially down the final stretch where he hit him really hard and stumbled him, where you see Tevin Farmer nearly lose the legs from under him, but managed to stay up and remain on his bicycle, and time just started getting the best of the fight, favoring Tevin Farmer, and you would see the urgency on Muratalla, where he was recognizing that he could eliminate this opponent and come away with a highlight reel type stoppage, or at least drop him to secure the victory instead of leaving it up in the balances. In the end, he gets a unanimous decision win, where Tim Cheatham gives him a 95-94 win. David Sutherland scores a 97-92, a lot wider, and Steve Weisfeld 96-93. There was something else that came into play with that decision, and that was a point deduction in round 8 that the referee deducts from Farmer because he tells him that he's holding too much. He had warned him before. Not everybody agreed that the point was warranted, but almost everybody knew that that point was going to be crucial if it came down to the scorecards, and that was the case. 95-94 and 96-93 is pretty much right. The 97-92 card was a lot wider. That's the one, there's always one that most people will disagree with, but a 96-93 was fairly accurate, because even though in the final numbers Tevin Farmer outlands or has a better punch percentage than Muratalla, stat-wise, it was evident that Muratalla was starting to bring it on and put it on Tevin Farmer and fight with a little bit more urgency in the final rounds, while Tevin Farmer looked like he was just cruising to a victory, because he might have been under the impression that he was just winning on all scorecards and he was going to cruise to a victory. And instead, that point ends up coming into play, and having dropped several of the rounds down the final stretch, that ends up awarding the victory to Raymond Muratalla. Muratalla has the NABO lightweight title, which is out of the WBO organization. It was vacant, and it was put on the line for these two fighters. And he now has a ticket to knock on the door of newly crowned WBO champ Denis BERINCHYK. Muratalla called out BERINCHYK and called out Shakur Stevenson after the fight. Shakur Stevenson, being that he was on the final fight of his contract with Top Rank, is amidst negotiations where he's already had meetings with Golden Boy. He's had meetings with Floyd Mayweather. He's had meetings with Eddie Hearn. And all signs are pointing to him staying away from Top Rank and heading in a new direction. Everything seems to be pointing towards Shakur heading towards a Matchroom pact. Raymond Muratalla, should Shakur be willing to do a fight-to-fight basis with Top Rank, then they could probably get that fight signed. If Shakur would have stayed with Top Rank or re-signed with Top Rank, well, they have Dennis BERINCHYK, they have Lomachenko, they have Raymond Muratalla, who is knocking on the door of titles. But here's a story with Muratalla where he was just destroying everybody up until he started fighting lengthier fights. He's still flawless. He still has a perfect record. But up until November of 22, which was the last time that he fought an 8-round fight, all of those fights he was stopping early. With the exception of Jair Valtierra, who was an 8-round decision victory for him. And he had early decisions early in his career. But then he starts a 10-round fight. He still, to date, has not fought a 12-round fight. So the most that he's fought has been 10 rounds. And his stamina is something to look out for because he does start slowing down. Even though he fought a little bit different here with Tevin Farmer, his last fight with Solisani and Dejeni was a fight that people were booing when they were in the stands. They were booing at how little action there was with Endogeni trying to stay on his bicycle and complicate the fight for Muratalla. He got on his bike, he got on the movement, was bobbing and weaving and sticking to pot-shotting Muratalla, and it was frustrating Muratalla. Everybody was tuned in and at the edge of their seats thinking that this was going to be another knockout and continue his trajectory that he had built to date. Including when one fight prior where he fights Diego Torres Nunez, who was a highly profiled prospect, soon to be contender, undefeated when he went into that fight, ends up getting stopped in the 8th round by Raymond Muratalla. Muratalla remained unblemished. Diego Torres Nunez suffers the first loss of his career and the only loss of his career to date, and has since gotten back to his winning ways. He had a successful fight in late May and won by unanimous decision over Martin Morales. That was the fight leading into the Endogeni fight where, remember, Endogeni had just fought. Who was it that he had just come off of a fight against, and it was a loss too. Arnold Barbosa, who's the newest signee. That was the debut for Arnold Barbosa with Golden Boy at 140. So Endogeni had fought Ernesto Mercado, who was an undefeated fighter. He lost by unanimous decision, July of 23, a year ago. Then he fights Arnold Barbosa Jr., and that was an 8-round, or where he stopped in the 8th round by Barbosa, January of this year. 2 months later, he fights Raymond Muratalla, unanimous decision loss. That's a fight that Muratalla, being at those levels, needed to have stopped a fighter that was coming off of a stoppage loss. Especially a fighter who had just fought at a heavier weight, ended up faring out better when he came down 5 pounds to fight Muratalla. So he didn't look the greatest there, and he didn't look the greatest here with Tevin Farmer for him to warrant a fight against Shakur Stevenson. But he does have the WBO NABO title now, which is basically giving him a ticket towards a title shot a full version title shot at the world title that Denis BERINCHYK now holds. Being that Shakur Stevenson has now left Top Rank and he didn't leave in the best of terms, by way of his critique and his criticisms over the way that Top Rank was running his career, even though they made him into a formidable star within the boxing realms, don't be surprised if Top Rank ices out Shakur from unifying with BERINCHYK and unifying with Lomachenko, and Muratalla gets the shot at BERINCHYK, which would be an in-house tight fight, and it would be a title fight. A great shot for Muratalla to win and become full world champion. But a complicated fight at that, just judging by the style that Denis BERINCHYK poses and what we saw against his fight with Navarrete, where it was such a complicated fight, complicated style, very elusive and very odd in the way in which he fights. But he makes it work for himself. BERINCHYK does. And now he's a world champion. The style that has gotten him so much success throughout his career garnered him a world title shot, and now has taken him as far as becoming a world champion. BERINCHYK is seen as the weakest of the champions, but he's a tough task. After the Cepeda fight, it looks like Golden Boy said that they were in conversations with BERINCHYK and Cepeda to be able to have a showdown between them. That would be a complicated fight for William Cepeda as well. Especially if Cepeda fights all action and takes the fight in punches and bunches type style against BERINCHYK, which is something that Navarrete tried to do, and the fight complicated itself for him and then started getting out of his grasp and eventually got out of his control, out of his reach, and he lost the decision. Lucky for Navarrete, he still is a world champion in the same organization, or for that same organization, 5 pounds south at 130 pounds. There's conversations that Navarrete has been struggling, and it's widely known, widely reported that he struggled with his weight. So it's going to be very telling to see if he actually returns to 130 to defend his title in what would be their unification against Oscar Valdez, who holds the interim title at the moment for the WBO, and what would be a rematch for them. Or if he gives Albert Bell, who I believe is the number 1 ranked fighter for the WBO, Prince Bell, if he gives him a shot at the title. We'll see what happens. Or if he vacates and just wants to campaign at 135. Tevin Farmer didn't change his style. This is the style that has gotten him so much success. And I don't think he needs to change his style. He just needs to be more active. Tevin Farmer fought in March of this year against Alan Lucas Castillo, where he comes away with the knockout in the first round. He fought Oscar Barajas, who was a 7-8 fighter. Alan Lucas Castillo had a 27-14 record. And then he fought Avery Sparrow with an 11-4 record. And these are 3 wins that he got under his belt with lesser level opposition, lower level opposition. Since his defeat, this is dating back to 2020 when he lost to Joseph Diaz. And that was a fight at 130 pounds. Tevin Farmer needs to be more active. And he needs to fight. And he needs to start fighting Jose Pedraza and get himself with decent names who are on the back end of their career. But Tevin Farmer is somewhat on that level as well. He needs to fight Tevin Farmer. He needs to get in there with Keyshawn Davis. He needs to start getting in there with fighters that are either up and coming and building a name for themselves, or fighters that are on their way out. If Jorge Linares comes to mind, but he's now since retired. But he needs to fight fighters in that level, where they find themselves at that stage in their career, on the back end of their career. Maybe fight Cambosos. That would be possibly an entertaining fight. With the styles, very similar, very contrasting styles. But he needs to be active. He needs to fight. This was a big shot for him, and he let it get away from him. And for Muratalla, he's not the killer that we all thought he was. because these are opponents that he should have stopped. So for him to ask against BERINCHYK, I would actually slightly favor Dennis BERINCHYK, even though most would go with Raymond Muratalla. I would highly favor Dennis BERINCHYK, just seeing that Muratalla has somewhat of a similar, I'm not saying twin styles, but he has somewhat of a similar style to that of Vaquero Navarrete. And we know what BERINCHYK did to Navarrete and the way he complicated and muddied the waters for him. And he will more than likely do that to Muratalla. For Tevin Farmer, he needs to fight Nakatila. He needs to get in there with Endogeni. He needs to get in there with these type of fighters and just get on a good win streak of fighters that have complicated the fights for others. And look good and shine to get himself into a bigger name. Tevin Farmer and Kambosos would be a great fight for both of them. So that's the takeaway from there. This was the co-main event. And it got elevated to the main event because Janibek, who's been talking a lot and calling out Carlos Adames, calling out Charlo, calling out Lara, calling out everybody and anybody who's anybody, Hamza Shiraz, and you name it. He's calling out everybody, claiming to be the dominant force at middleweight, and then beyond dehydrates himself to where he can't even debut in what was going to be a headlining moment for him out in Las Vegas. Putting his 2 titles on the line and then heading on to a potential showdown with Carlos Adames. Now, he basically just affected his own trajectory. He's been big on social media, calling anybody and everybody out. And can't even make his fight to put those titles on the line. Shane Mosley Jr., who was successful on the undercard of Nate Diaz and Jorge Masvidal recently, he defeated a former champion, middleweight champion in Danny Jacobs. You got the Bully returning, but he's fighting at 168. Sergey's fighting at 168. Danny and Shane Mosley fought at middleweight. Shane Mosley Jr. passed up on a Carlos Adames fight to face Danny Jacobs and get a big name under his belt. And now he's going to resume or at least return to negotiations for Carlos Adames and see if he could get that fight for himself. Maybe. And Carlos Adames is tied up because he's got a fight on the undercard of Madrimov Crawford, if I remember correctly. Let me look that up. So Shane Mosley Jr. should be calling out Erislandy Lara. But if he doesn't get it, then go after Vito Melnicki. Go after fighters like that that are on the up and up right now. And continue to build that resume. Carlos Adames was... Okay, so I had the cards confused with Carlos Adames because so much has happened. He fought on the undercard of Tank Davis. And he defeated Tero Geisha. So his eyes were tuned in on what Janibek was going to do to get a potential showdown for 3 titles, maybe in the fall. Coming off of a victory himself, June 15th. He is the full version WBC title now that he got elevated to a full recognition of the championship. After Jermall Charlo had that title basically hostage for so long. As the WBC was standing by Jermall Charlo while he got his stuff under control, and then they finally end up stripping him and elevating Carlos Adames, who held that interim version title for quite a while. Now he's elevated to world champion. Now he successfully defends his title against Tero Geisha and now looking to unify. So Shane Mosley Jr. should be revisiting those talks with Carlos Adames, and that would be a good fight for Shane Mosley Jr. Should he be successful there, he will become world champion, following in the footsteps of his legendary father. But if Carlos Adames is successful for Shane Mosley Jr., and I would actually favor Adames to be successful over Shane Mosley Jr. That would be another great win for him to add to his resume and even add negotiation leverage if and when the fight does present itself with Janibek. But Janibek basically affected his own pocket by not being able to not just make weight, but the severe dehydration is now going to put him on the sidelines for some time. And now Top Rank has to either reschedule the rematch or seek another opponent and keep his career going and do it fast. Maybe in August or a September show, but they got to do it fast because this did not look good for him, and he's the unified champ, the only unified champ at 160. For Erislandy Lara, he's also another one who's on the back end of his career and is holding that WBA title somewhat hostage by doing the bare minimums to defend that title. He's coming off a win from March against Michael Sarafa. Since then, he didn't fight the entire year of 2023 and still had the title around him. And that was in May 28th of 22 when he beat Gary Spike O'Sullivan. Didn't defend it the rest of the year, didn't defend it all of 23, and returned in March of this year against Michael Sarafa, and he got the knockout. Prior to Spike O'Sullivan, he faced Thomas Lamana, where he knocked out Lamana in the first round. And then he fought Greg Vendetti. I mean, you think about this level of opposition, he's just another one who's holding the title hostage. They need to seek that fight, and hopefully Adames and Lara will be in talks. I would favor Carlos Adames to dethrone Erislandy Lara as he finds himself in the back end of his career. So that was a story with Raymond Muratalla. We get off on track, but that's how he ended up becoming a headliner of this event. Raymond Muratalla calling Dennis BERINCHYK is a lot more realistic than him getting into a showdown with Shakur Stevenson. And that just high risk, low reward for Shakur Stevenson, where he's looking for a high risk, high reward type of fight. And one of the top dogs in the division. Loma and Tank seem to be in conversations to face off against one another in late fall of this year. That would be an amazing fight should it come to fruition. Camarón Cepeda looks to be in talks with Dennis BERINCHYK himself to be able to get himself the first world title shot of his career. And if not, then he's been calling out Shakur as well, and that would be a great fight for them to make. If Shakur heads to Eddie Hearn in a promotional pact, Eddie Hearn and Golden Boy have worked together in the past, even though they don't like each other very much. They're like an on and off type relationship. Don't forget that they just worked together earlier this year in Jaime Munguia, John Ryder, and then went on to work against one another, even though they had a lot of comments to exchange at one another in the Devin Haney, Ryan Garcia. So they've already had multiple times that they've worked with one another this year. And then he was involved in some form or fashion with the Canelo Munguia event as well, even though PBC was the one leading the card. So Eddie Hearn finds himself a way to get himself into these fights, and I wouldn't be surprised that he would make the negotiations fairly easy and make a fight with Shakur against William Cepeda if Cepeda doesn't secure that BERINCHYK fight. Which at that point, Muratalla would make sense for Top Rank to give Muratalla and BERINCHYK that type of showdown. So congrats to Raymond Muratalla. It's been back-to-back fights where he doesn't really impress, but he remains undefeated. And he remains a name to recognize at lightweight. He's another tough challenge for anybody who steps in the ring against him. I just feel like these last two fights have not been the greatest showings for him, for someone whose trajectory was on the up and up and should have had a world title shot already. But now he's there. He's knocking on the door, just like William Cepeda. A fight with Muratalla and William Cepeda wouldn't make sense. because they're both on similar spots in their career. Maybe with William Cepeda having a little more leverage, marketability wise, money wise, he's got a little bit more leverage favoring him to negotiate a higher payday than what Muratalla brings to the table at the moment. So Muratalla, hopefully he lands another big fight. I don't think he's going to get a title shot in his very next outing, but I do think that an easier fight for him to make is going to be Top Rank stepping in and getting him lined up with BERINCHYK if those talks fall apart with him and William Cepeda. Meaning that William Cepeda would not go through with that fight, not because of money, but they would not go through with that fight if a bigger payday presents itself, that being SHAKUR. So very interesting the way the lightweight division is panning out. Very, very interesting. And so congrats, Raymond Muratalla. We'll leave you guys with that, and I'll check you guys all out on the next episode. Have a good one.